She stood in the principal's office with trembling hands, staring at the letter that would change everything. The words blurred through her tears, but the meaning was crystal clear. Immediate termination for unauthorized guardianship of students. Elizabeth Ray had 24 hours to fix what they called a dangerous breach of protocol, or her teaching career would end in disgrace. Outside the window, 3 small faces pressed against the glass of her portable classroom, waiting for the woman who had become their entire world. And in that moment, Elizabeth realized that some choices don't give you the luxury of time to think, because love doesn't wait for permission, and neither does survival. But to understand how she arrived at this impossible crossroads, we need to go back to where it all began. Elizabeth Ray had been teaching for 24 years in one of Lagos's most overlooked public schools, tucked away in a forgotten corner of Surulere, where the wealthy never ventured and the government rarely remembered. Her classroom wasn't really a classroom at all, but a portable structure that leaked during the rainy season and baked like an oven during the dry months. The walls were covered with hand-painted posters she'd made herself, inspirational quotes written in bright colors that had faded over time, and shelves crammed with second-hand books she'd bought from street vendors with money she couldn't afford to spend. She lived in a one-bedroom house that was falling apart piece by piece, where the walls had cracks that grew wider every year, and the plumbing made sounds that kept her awake at night. Most of her salary went toward school supplies because the government allocation never came, and what little remained went toward feeding students who arrived at school with hunger written across their faces. Her colleagues thought she was foolish, her neighbors thought she was reckless, and the school administration thought she was too soft for her own good. But Elizabeth had learned something in 24 years of teaching children that society had already given up on. Sometimes the only thing standing between a child and complete darkness is one person who refuses to look away. She had seen too many students fall through the cracks, too many bright eyes dimmed by neglect and poverty, too many futures stolen before they had a chance to begin. And she had made a promise to herself long ago that as long as she had breath in her body and strength in her heart, she would never stop fighting for the children nobody else wanted. Then came that Monday morning in July when the rains turned Lagos into a maze of flooded streets and the sky hung low and grey over the city. Elizabeth arrived at school soaked to the bone because she'd walked the last 2 kilometers after the Damfo bus broke down, and she was already running late for the first period. She rushed into her classroom, shaking water from her umbrella and apologizing to the students who were supposed to be waiting, but the room was strangely quiet. That's when she saw them. 3 children sat in the back corner of the classroom, pressed together on a single bench like they were trying to take up as little space as possible. 2 boys and 1 girl, probably around 7 or 8 years old, with faces so similar they had to be siblings. Their clothes were soaked through and clinging to their thin frames, their shoes were caked with mud, and their eyes were fixed on the floor like they were afraid to look up and be seen. They had no bags, no books, no pencils, just empty hands folded in their laps, and an air of exhaustion that children their age should never carry. Elizabeth's first thought was that they were new students, perhaps transfers from another school, and she waited for someone from the office to bring their registration papers. But nobody came. She taught her morning lessons while keeping one eye on the 3 silent figures in the back, watching as they never moved, never spoke, never raised their hands. When the other students went outside for break, the triplets stayed seated, and when Elizabeth offered them some of the akara she'd brought for lunch, they took it with whispered thank yous but wouldn't meet her eyes. After school ended, Elizabeth stayed late as she always did, cleaning the classroom and preparing for the next day. Through the window, she saw the 3 children sitting on the curb outside the school gate, their small bodies hunched against the drizzle that had started again. She watched them for 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. No parents came. No guardian appeared. They just sat there in the growing darkness, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. The next day they were back in her classroom before she arrived, sitting in the same spot, wearing the same damp clothes that clearly hadn't dried overnight. Elizabeth checked with the school office, but there was no record of them, no enrollment forms, nothing. The secretary shrugged and said they'd probably wandered in from the street and would be gone soon enough. But they weren't gone. They came back every day that week, silent and watchful, and every afternoon Elizabeth saw them sitting on that same curb, waiting in vain. On Friday afternoon, Elizabeth couldn't bear it anymore. She walked over to where they sat and crouched down to their level, ignoring the ache in her knees and the rain that was starting to fall harder. The children looked at her with wide, cautious eyes, like animals that had been hurt too many times to trust easily. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Elizabeth asked gently, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them that only siblings would understand. Finally, The girl, who seemed to be the youngest despite their similar ages, pulled her hood tighter around her face and shook her head. "Just around, Ma," she whispered, her voice so small that Elizabeth had to lean closer to hear it. "Round where?" Elizabeth pressed, though part of her already knew the answer and dreaded it. "Anywhere that's dry," one of the boys said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, like he was describing something perfectly normal. Elizabeth felt her heart crack open in her chest. She thought about the procedures, the protocols, the proper channels she was supposed to follow. She thought about calling social services, about filing reports, about letting the system handle it the way the system was supposed to handle these things. She thought about all the reasons why what she was about to do was foolish and dangerous and completely against every rule in the book. And then she thought about these 3 children spending another night on the streets of Lagos, cold, hungry and alone. "Come with me," she said, making a decision that would change all of their lives forever. "Hey my people, I need to pause right here for just a moment because this story is about to take you on a journey that will break your heart and put it back together again. If you're feeling this already, do me a favor and drop a like on this video and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Are you in Lagos, London, New York, Johannesburg? Let me know, and don't forget to subscribe so you can join this storytelling family, because trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Now let's get back to Elizabeth, because what happened next would set everything in motion. Elizabeth took the 3 children home that night, and her tiny house that barely fit 1 person suddenly held 4. She made grilled cheese sandwiches because it was all she had in the fridge, and she heated water for baths because the heater had stopped working months ago. She gave them towels that were threadbare but clean, and she pulled out every spare blanket she owned to make sleeping spots on her living room floor. The children ate like they hadn't seen food in days, which they probably hadn't, and when Elizabeth asked their names, they told her in voices that were still guarded and uncertain. Michael, Marcus and Maya. The triplets, born within minutes of each other, though their mother had passed during childbirth and their father had disappeared shortly after. They'd been bounced between relatives who didn't want them and shelters that couldn't keep them, until finally they'd ended up on their own, surviving on the streets and sleeping wherever they could find shelter. Elizabeth listened to their story with tears streaming down her face, and when they finished talking, she made them a promise that she wasn't sure she could keep but knew she had to try. "I'm not trying to be your mother," she said, tucking the thin blankets around their shoulders as they lay on her floor. "I just want you to be safe, to learn, to have a chance at something better. Can we try that together?" 3 small heads nodded in the darkness, and for the first time since she'd met them, Elizabeth saw something other than fear in their eyes. It was small and fragile and might have been hope. That night, Elizabeth lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft breathing of 3 children who were now depending on her. She thought about her empty bank account, her crumbling house, her meager salary that barely kept her afloat. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the obstacles they would face, all the judgment that would surely come. But when morning arrived, and she saw 3 small faces looking at her with something that might have been trust beginning to form, she knew she'd made the right choice. Even if it cost her everything, what Elizabeth didn't know was that someone had already seen the children leaving school with her. Someone who didn't approve. Someone who was already making phone calls that would bring Elizabeth's world crashing down around her. By Monday morning, there was a letter waiting for her in the principal's office, and her nightmare was just beginning. The principal's office smelled like old paper and disappointment, and Elizabeth sat in the hard plastic chair with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Principal Adebio sat across from her, a heavy-set man with greying temples and eyes that had seen too many teachers come and go to be impressed by good intentions anymore. He slid the letter across his desk toward her, and even though Elizabeth had already read it 3 times, her eyes scanned the words again as if they might somehow change. "Mrs. Okonkwo from the Parent-Teacher Association filed a formal complaint," Principal Adebio said, his voice heavy with the kind of weariness that comes from fighting battles nobody ever wins. "She saw you leaving the premises with 3 unregistered students on Friday evening. She says you took them to your home without proper authorization, without guardian consent, without any documentation whatsoever." "Elizabeth, what were you thinking?" Elizabeth looked up from the letter, and her voice came out steadier than she felt inside. "I was thinking that 3 children were sleeping on the streets, sir. I was thinking that they needed help, and I was the only one who seemed to notice they existed." "That's not your job," Principal Adebio said, and there was something almost like sympathy in his tone, which somehow made it worse. "Your job is to teach them during school hours and send them home when the bell rings. You're not a social worker, you're not a foster parent, and you're certainly not authorized to take children into your home without going through the proper legal channels." The proper legal channels, Elizabeth repeated, and she could hear her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. Sir, do you know how long those channels take? Do you know how many children fall through the cracks while we're filling out paperwork and waiting for approvals that never come? Those children would have spent another week on the streets while social services reviewed their case, if social services even bothered to open a file at all. Principal Adebayo rubbed his temples like he was fighting off a headache that had been building for years. I understand your heart is in the right place, Elizabeth. I've watched you for 2 decades, and I know you care about these children more than anyone else in this building. But caring isn't enough when you're breaking protocols that exist to protect both the children and the school. Mrs. Okonkwo is threatening to take this to the school board, and if she does, they won't see a dedicated teacher trying to help. They'll see a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen, and they'll shut you down so fast it'll make your head spin. So what are you saying? Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it spoken out loud. I'm saying you need to take those children to social services today, Principal Adebayo said, and his voice was firm now, the voice of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be swayed. You need to file the proper reports, let the system handle it the way it's supposed to be handled, and you need to step back before this destroys your career. You have 24 hours to make this right, Elizabeth, or I'll have no choice but to recommend your immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Elizabeth felt the floor drop out from beneath her, even though she was still sitting in the chair. 24 hours. 1 day to undo what she'd started, to send 3 children back into a system that had already failed them countless times, to break the fragile trust she'd just begun to build. She thought about Michael, Marcus, and Maya sitting in her classroom right now, probably watching the door and wondering if today would be the day she disappeared like everyone else in their lives had disappeared. And if I don't, Elizabeth asked quietly, then you'll be terminated, Principal Adebayo said, and there was genuine regret in his eyes now. And Mrs. Okonkwo will make sure every school in Lagos knows why, which means you'll never teach again. Is that really what you want? To throw away 24 years of service for 3 children you barely know? Elizabeth stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath her, and she picked up the letter from the desk. With all due respect, sir, I know those children better than anyone else seems to want to. I know they're scared and hungry and alone. I know they deserve a chance at something better than what they've been given. And I know that if I send them back into that system right now, I'll never see them again, and neither will anyone else who actually cares whether they live or fall through the cracks. She walked toward the door, but Principal Adebayo's voice stopped her before she could leave. Elizabeth, please think about what you're doing. Think about your future. Elizabeth turned back to look at him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but unmovable. I am thinking about the future, sir, just not my own. The rest of that day passed in a blur of anxiety and determination that fought for space in Elizabeth's chest. She taught her classes on autopilot, going through the motions of multiplication tables and reading comprehension while her mind raced through possibilities and dead ends. The triplets sat in their usual spot in the back of the classroom, and every time Elizabeth looked at them, she saw the question they were too afraid to ask. Are you going to send us away? When the final bell rang, and the other students scattered toward home, Michael, Marcus, and Maya stayed in their seats, waiting. Elizabeth gathered her things slowly, buying herself time to figure out what she was going to say, how she was going to explain that the world was more complicated than a 7-year-old should have to understand. Come on, she finally said, holding out her hand. Let's go home. The relief that washed over their faces nearly broke her, but she held herself together because that's what adults do when children are watching. They walked to her house through the dusty streets of Surula, past the vendors selling akara and plantain, past the mechanic shops and the churches and the endless stream of yellow buses coughing exhaust into the heavy air. Elizabeth bought suya from a street corner because she didn't have the energy to cook, and the children ate it like it was a feast. That night, after they'd bathed and settled into their makeshift beds on her living room floor, Maya looked up at Elizabeth with eyes that were too old for her small face. Are you going to send us away? She asked, and the question hung in the air like a knife. Elizabeth knelt down beside her and brushed a strand of hair from Maya's forehead. No, baby, I'm not going to send you away. But what about your job? Michael asked from across the room, and Elizabeth realized that they'd heard more than she thought they had, that children always hear the things adults try to hide. My job is to take care of you, Elizabeth said, and as she spoke the words, she felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that cut through all the fear and doubt. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Hey fam, I need to stop right here, because what Elizabeth did next was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd ever done. And honestly, it was probably both. If this story is gripping your heart the way it's gripping mine, please drop a like and let me know in the comments if you think Elizabeth made the right choice. Would you risk everything for 3 children you barely knew? Subscribe to join this family because episode 3 is going to take us somewhere you won't see coming. Now let's get back to Elizabeth, because the next morning brought a visitor she didn't expect. Elizabeth woke up before dawn on Tuesday, her mind already racing through the day ahead. She had to go to work, had to face Principal Adebio and probably Mrs. Okonkwo, had to figure out how to keep her job and keep the children safe at the same time. She made breakfast for the triplets with the last of her bread and eggs, packed them simple lunches in paper bags, and walked them to school through streets that were just beginning to wake up. In her classroom, she taught with a fierceness that surprised even her, pouring everything she had into every lesson, because if this was going to be her last week as a teacher, she was going to make it count. The triplets watched her with something like awe, and the other students sensed that something had shifted, that their usually gentle teacher had found a spine of steel they hadn't known existed. At lunchtime, there was a knock on her classroom door, and Elizabeth's heart jumped into her throat because she thought it might be Principal Adebio coming to escort her off campus. But when she opened the door, she found a woman she'd never seen before, middle-aged and well-dressed in the kind of expensive Ankara print that marked her as someone with money and status. "Miss Elizabeth Ray?" the woman asked, and her voice was cool and assessing. "Yes, that's me," Elizabeth said, stepping outside and closing the door so the children wouldn't hear whatever was coming next. "My name is Mrs. Okonkwo," the woman said, and Elizabeth felt her stomach drop because this was the woman who'd filed the complaint, the woman who was trying to destroy everything. "I think we need to have a conversation about those children you've taken into your home." Elizabeth straightened her spine and met Mrs. Okonkwo's eyes directly. "What would you like to know?" "I'd like to know what makes you think you have the right to play savior," Mrs. Okonkwo said, and her voice was sharp enough to cut. "I'd like to know what makes you think a woman living in poverty, barely able to feed herself, has any business taking responsibility for 3 children who need proper care and resources. I'd like to know if you've even considered that your pride and your misguided sense of charity might actually be harming them rather than helping them." The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows, but she didn't step back and she didn't look away. "I've considered that every single day since they came into my life," she said quietly. "I've thought about every way this could go wrong, every reason why someone else might be better equipped to care for them. But here's what I know, Mrs. Okonkwo. I know that those children were sleeping on the streets while people with proper resources and status walked past them every single day without stopping. I know that the system you're so eager to protect failed them long before I ever met them. And I know that sometimes love and commitment matter more than money." Mrs. Okonkwo's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been respect, or might have been calculation. "Love doesn't pay for medical bills when they get sick. Love doesn't provide proper nutrition or educational opportunities, or a stable home environment. What happens when you can't afford to feed them? What happens when they need things you can't provide?" "Then I'll figure it out," Elizabeth said, and her voice was steady now, anchored by a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. "I'll work extra jobs, I'll ask for help, I'll do whatever it takes, but I won't abandon them the way everyone else has." Mrs. Okonkwo studied her for a long moment, and Elizabeth couldn't read what she saw in the other woman's face. Finally, Mrs. Okonkwo reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I'm going to be watching you, Miss Ray," she said, pressing the card into Elizabeth's hand. "If I see any sign that those children are suffering because of your inadequacy, I will personally ensure that they're removed from your care and you never teach again. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Elizabeth said, though her hand was shaking as she took the card. Mrs. Okonkwo turned to leave but paused at the top of the stairs. "For what it's worth," she said without looking back, "I hope you prove me wrong." Then she was gone, leaving Elizabeth standing alone outside her classroom with a business card, and a threat that felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She looked down at the card and saw that it listed Mrs. Okonkwo as the head of the school's parent-teacher association and a member of the local education board. This woman had the power to destroy her with a single phone call, and she just promised to be watching every move Elizabeth made. Elizabeth walked back into her classroom where the triplets were sitting quietly at their desks, and she forced herself to smile even though her hands were still shaking. She had 24 hours to make a decision that would determine the course of all their lives, and she still had no idea what she was going to do. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Elizabeth sat at her tiny kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. She added up her salary, subtracted her expenses, and stared at the number that remained. It was barely enough to keep herself alive, let alone 3 growing children. She would need to find more work, but when? She was already exhausted from teaching all day, and there were only so many hours in a night. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo's words, about love not being enough, about pride and misguided charity. She thought about Principal Adebio's ultimatum, about 24 years of service that could end in disgrace. She thought about the easy path, the sensible path, the path that would save her career and her reputation and her future. And then she looked at the 3 small forms sleeping on her living room floor, at the way they'd curled up close to each other for comfort, at the peace on their faces that hadn't been there a week ago. She thought about Maya asking if she was going to send them away, about the fear in Michael's eyes when he asked about her job, about Marcus, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words, but who'd started holding her hand when they crossed the street. Elizabeth picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago, but never thought she'd use. It rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello. Jennifer, it's Elizabeth Ray," she said, and her voice was stronger than she felt. "I know it's late, and I'm sorry for calling, but I need a lawyer, and I need one who works for people who can't afford to pay." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Jennifer Williams, her former student who'd gone on to law school and come back to Lagos to fight for the voiceless, said the words that changed everything. "Tell me what you need." Elizabeth started talking, and with every word she felt the path ahead becoming clearer even as it became more difficult. She was going to fight. She was going to fight the school board, the parent-teacher association, the system that had failed these children and anyone else who tried to tear them apart. She was going to fight with everything she had, and if she lost her job in the process, then at least she'd lose its standing for something that mattered. What Elizabeth didn't know was that someone else was making phone calls that night. Someone with power and connections, and a determination that matched her own. Someone who'd been watching from the shadows and had just decided to make a move that would change the game entirely. By morning, the stakes would be higher than Elizabeth could have possibly imagined, and the battle lines would be drawn in ways that would shake the entire school community to its core. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of humidity that made Lagos feel like a sauna, and Elizabeth Ray walked into her classroom to find an envelope taped to her desk. Her name was written across the front in neat, official handwriting, and her stomach twisted into knots before she even opened it because nothing good ever came in envelopes delivered this way. Inside was a single sheet of paper, stamped with the school board's official seal, informing her that an emergency meeting had been scheduled for Friday afternoon to review her conduct and determine her employment status moving forward. 2 days. She had 2 days to prepare a defense for a choice she'd made with her heart instead of her head, and she had no idea how to explain to a room full of administrators why love should matter more than protocol. Elizabeth folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her bag, then turned to face her classroom where the triplets were already seated in their usual spot, watching her with eyes that missed nothing. "Good morning, my dear ones," she said, forcing brightness into her voice that she didn't feel. "Today we're going to learn about fractions, and I promise to make it more interesting than it sounds." The day unfolded in a strange rhythm of normalcy and undercurrent tension, like dancing on the edge of a cliff while pretending the ground was solid beneath her feet. Elizabeth taught her lessons with the same passion she always brought to her classroom, but in the back of her mind, she was constantly aware of the ticking clock, the approaching deadline, the battle she was about to face. During lunch, she met with Jennifer Williams in the teacher's lounge, a small windowless room that smelled like instant coffee and resignation. Jennifer was 32 years old and already had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, defending people who couldn't pay and fighting systems that seemed too big to challenge. She sat across from Elizabeth with a yellow legal pad covered in notes, and her expression was serious, but not without hope. "I've been reviewing Lagos state education law all night," Jennifer said, tapping her pen against the pad. "The good news is that there's no explicit regulation preventing a teacher from providing temporary shelter to a student in crisis. The bad news is that there's also no protection for doing so, which means the school board has discretionary authority to determine whether your actions constitute professional misconduct. So basically, they can decide whatever they want," Elizabeth said, and it wasn't really a question. "Basically, yes," Jennifer confirmed. "But here's what we're going to argue. We're going to demonstrate that you acted in the best interest of the children's immediate safety, that you attempted to work within the system by checking for their records and asking the administration about their status, and that your actions were temporary measures while you sought proper legal guardianship through the appropriate channels." Elizabeth blinked. "Legal guardianship? Jennifer, I can barely afford to feed myself. How am I supposed to navigate a guardianship case?" "That's where I come in," Jennifer said, and a small smile touched her lips. "I'm going to represent you pro bono, which means you don't pay me a single naira, and I'm going to help you file for emergency guardianship based on abandonment and imminent danger to the children's welfare." It's not going to be easy, and it's going to take time, but if we can show the school board that you're following legal procedures, it gives them a reason to let you keep your job while the case moves forward. Elizabeth felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back because she'd cried enough in the past few days to fill an ocean, and right now she needed to be strong. Why are you doing this, Jennifer? You could be making real money at a corporate firm, but instead you're here helping a broke teacher fight a system that's rigged against us. Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. Because you're the reason I became a lawyer, Miss Ray. When I was in your class 15 years ago, I was failing everything and everyone had given up on me. But you stayed after school every day for 6 months to tutor me, and you never made me feel stupid or worthless. You told me I could be anything I wanted to be if I worked hard enough, and you made me believe it was true. So now I'm here to fight for you the way you fought for me. The tears came then, sliding down Elizabeth's cheeks before she could stop them, and Jennifer handed her a tissue without saying anything because some moments don't need words. They sat together in that cramped teacher's lounge planning their strategy, going over every detail of what had happened and how they would present it, building a defense out of compassion and desperation, and the belief that sometimes doing the right thing should count for something. That evening, Elizabeth took the triplets with her to the local government office where Jennifer had arranged for them to file the emergency guardianship petition. The building was old and overcrowded, with peeling paint and ceiling fans that barely moved the thick air, and they waited for 3 hours on hard plastic chairs before their number was finally called. A tired-looking clerk took their paperwork, stamped it with mechanical efficiency, and told them it would be 6 to 8 weeks before they received a hearing date. 6 to 8 weeks, Elizabeth repeated, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. These children need protection now, not 2 months from now. The clerk looked at her with the expression of someone who'd heard this complaint 1,000 times and stopped caring somewhere around complaint number 3. That's the timeline, Ma. If you want it to go faster, you can hire a private attorney to expedite the process. We have an attorney, Jennifer said, stepping forward and placing her business card on the counter. And we're requesting emergency consideration based on immediate danger to the minors' welfare. These children were living on the streets before Miss Ray took them in, and if this guardianship isn't processed quickly, they'll end up back in that situation. The clerk glanced at the business card, then at Jennifer's determined face, then back at the paperwork. Something in Jennifer's tone must have convinced him that this was a fight he didn't want to have, because he sighed and stamped the papers with a different seal. I'll mark it as urgent, he said, but I can't promise anything faster than 4 weeks, and that's if everything goes smoothly. 4 weeks. It still felt like an eternity, but it was better than 8. And Elizabeth thanked him with genuine gratitude because small victories were all she had right now. They left the government office as the sun was setting over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the triplets held onto Elizabeth's hands as they navigated the crowded streets toward home. Hey my people, I have to pause here because what I'm about to tell you next is going to shift this entire story in a direction you're not expecting. If you're invested in Elizabeth's fight, show some love by hitting that like button, and drop a comment telling me what you think is going to happen at that school board meeting. Do you think she has a chance? And don't forget to subscribe because this journey is far from over, and you're going to want to see where we're headed. Now let's get back to Elizabeth, because Thursday brought a surprise that nobody saw coming. Thursday morning started like any other morning, with Elizabeth dragging herself out of bed before dawn to make breakfast for 4 people instead of 1, and trying to stretch her meager salary to cover expenses that seemed to multiply by the hour. She was washing dishes when there was a knock at her door, firm and authoritative, and her first thought was that it was the police coming to arrest her for some violation she didn't even know she'd committed. But when she opened the door, she found Mrs. Okonkwo standing on her doorstep, and this time the woman wasn't alone. Behind her stood 3 other women, all dressed in expensive clothes and carrying an air of authority that made Elizabeth instinctively straighten her spine. Miss Ray, Mrs. Okonkwo said, and her voice was formal but not unkind. May we come in? Elizabeth hesitated, glancing back at the triplets who were eating breakfast at her small kitchen table and watching the visitors with wary eyes. What is this about? We'd like to discuss your situation, Mrs. Okonkwo said, and I promise you we're not here to cause trouble. Elizabeth stepped aside and let them enter, and the 4 women filled her tiny living room in a way that made the space feel even smaller than it already was. Mrs. Okonkwo introduced her companions as members of the Parent-Teacher Association and influential figures in the Lagos education community, and Elizabeth felt her anxiety spike, because these were the people who had the power to destroy her career with a single vote. Miss Ray, we've been investigating your case, one of the women said, a tall, elegant woman named Mrs. Adami who wore gold jewellery that probably cost more than Elizabeth earned in a year. We've spoken to Principal Adebio, we've reviewed your employment record, and we've talked to several of your former students who are now adults in the community. What we've found is quite remarkable. Elizabeth didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and waited for the other shoe to drop. We found that you have a 24-year track record of going above and beyond for your students, Mrs. Adami continued. We've heard stories from parents whose children were struggling until they had you as a teacher, from students who credit you with changing their lives, from administrators who say you're the most dedicated educator they've ever worked with. Jennifer Williams spoke very highly of you, as did Marcus Okafor, who's now a doctor, and Kioma Nwasu, who runs a successful business in Lekki. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten because she remembered all those students, remembered staying late to help them with homework, remembered believing in them when nobody else would. She'd never expected any recognition for it, had never even thought to ask for it, because that wasn't why she taught. What we've also found, Mrs. Okonkwo said, taking over the conversation, is that those 3 children sitting at your table right now would be on the streets if it weren't for you. The social services system is overwhelmed and underfunded, and the chances of them being placed in a safe home within any reasonable timeframe are essentially 0. You acted impulsively, yes, but you also acted with genuine concern for their welfare, and that matters. Are you saying you're not going to fight me at the school board meeting? Elizabeth asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. We're saying that we're going to do something better than that, Mrs. Adami said, and she pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on Elizabeth's coffee table. We're going to help you. Elizabeth stared at the folder like it might explode, then looked up at the 4 women who were watching her with expressions that ranged from determined to almost warm. I don't understand. The Parent-Teacher Association has a discretionary fund for emergency family assistance, Mrs. Okonkwo explained. It's designed to help school families who are facing temporary hardship, and while you're not technically a school family in the traditional sense, we believe this situation qualifies. We're prepared to provide you with a monthly stipend to help cover the costs of caring for these children while your guardianship case moves through the courts. Elizabeth felt like the floor had tilted beneath her, like reality had shifted into a parallel dimension where people with power and money actually use those resources to help instead of to judge. Why would you do this? Because Mrs. Okonkwo called me last week and told me about what you'd done, Mrs. Adami said, and there was a hint of a smile on her face now. And at first I was skeptical. I thought you were being reckless and irresponsible, taking on a burden you couldn't handle. But then she told me to actually look into who you are and what you've accomplished with basically no resources and no support. And I realized that we've been failing you for 24 years, while you've been succeeding despite us. Mrs. Okonkwo nodded. I came to your classroom on Tuesday to confront you, but what I found was 3 children who clearly adored you, and a teacher who was pouring everything she had into making sure they felt safe and valued. I saw the way you looked at them, Miss Ray, and I recognized it because it's the same way I look at my own children. You weren't playing savior. You were being a mother to children who desperately needed one. Elizabeth couldn't stop the tears now, and she didn't even try because sometimes tears are the only appropriate response to grace you didn't expect and didn't earn. The triplets had abandoned their breakfast and come to stand beside her, sensing that something important was happening, even if they didn't fully understand what. There are conditions, Mrs. Okonkwo said, and her voice became businesslike again. You need to continue working with Jennifer to secure legal guardianship. You need to keep detailed records of the children's education and well-being. And you need to accept help when it's offered, which means letting us connect you with resources and support systems that you're going to need. I can do that, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking but sure. I can absolutely do that. Then consider this the beginning of a partnership, Mrs. Adami said, standing up and extending her hand. The school board meeting on Friday is still going to happen because protocol requires it, but we'll be there to speak on your behalf. You're not fighting this battle alone anymore, Miss Ray. The 4 women left as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving Elizabeth standing in her tiny living room with a folder full of paperwork, and a heart so full it felt like it might burst. She opened the folder with trembling hands and found forms for the Family Assistance Program, information about legal resources, and a check for an amount that would cover food and basic necessities for at least 3 months. Maya tugged on Elizabeth's shirt. Does this mean we can stay? Elizabeth knelt down and pulled all 3 children into a hug that was too tight and lasted too long, but none of them complained because they needed it as much as she did. Yes, baby, this means you can stay. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table and thought about the impossible chain of events that had led to this moment. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, how easily she could have chosen the safe path and sent the children away. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo, who'd started as an enemy and somehow become an ally, and Mrs. Ademi, who'd looked past her own prejudices to see the truth. But most of all, she thought about Jennifer's words from the day before. "You're the reason I became a lawyer." It had never occurred to Elizabeth that her work mattered beyond the immediate moment, that the seeds she planted in one student's life could grow into something that would come back to save her years later. The phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts, and when she answered it, she heard Jennifer's excited voice on the other end. "Elizabeth, you're not going to believe this, but I just got a call from the magistrate's office. Someone with significant influence pushed your guardianship case to the top of the priority list. We have a hearing scheduled for next week." "Next week," Elizabeth repeated, her mind struggling to process this new miracle. "But the clerk said it would take at least 4 weeks." "Well, someone must have made some calls," Jennifer said, and Elizabeth could hear the smile in her voice. "I have a feeling Mrs. Ademi might have friends in high places." Elizabeth hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of her kitchen, and for the first time since this whole journey began, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel before. Not just hope, but genuine belief that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out. What Elizabeth didn't know was that while she'd been gaining allies, she'd also been attracting attention from someone who saw her success as a threat, someone who believed that teachers should know their place and stay in it, and who was already planning a move that would test Elizabeth's resolve in ways she couldn't imagine. The school board meeting was tomorrow, and the real battle was about to begin. Friday afternoon came with a weight that pressed down on Elizabeth's chest from the moment she opened her eyes, and she moved through the morning routine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking no matter how many times she told herself to be calm. The school board meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which meant she had to teach a full day of classes, while knowing that her entire future hung in the balance of a decision that would be made in just a few hours. She dressed in her best outfit, a simple navy dress she'd bought 5 years ago for her sister's wedding, and she braided her hair with careful precision, because if she was going to face judgment, she wanted to look like someone who deserved a fair hearing. The triplets sensed her anxiety and stayed unusually quiet during breakfast, eating their oatmeal without the usual chatter and questions. And when it was time to leave for school, Maya reached up and squeezed Elizabeth's hand with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. "You're going to win," Maya said with the absolute certainty that only children possess, the kind of faith that hasn't yet learned to doubt itself. Elizabeth wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to that confidence and let it carry her through the day, but she'd lived long enough to know that wanting something and getting it were two very different things. She kissed each of their foreheads and sent them off to play with the other students while she prepared her classroom for what might be the last day she ever taught in it. The morning dragged by in slow motion, each minute stretching into an eternity, while Elizabeth tried to focus on teaching fractions and reading comprehension instead of the trial that awaited her. Her students seemed to pick up on her nervous energy and behaved with unusual restraint, as if they understood that something important was happening even if they didn't know exactly what. During lunch, Jennifer arrived at the school with a briefcase full of documents and a determined expression that made Elizabeth feel slightly more hopeful, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. "I've prepared our defense," Jennifer said, spreading papers across Elizabeth's desk like a general planning a battle strategy. "We're going to present character witnesses, documentation of your employment record, evidence of the children's situation before you intervened, and testimony from the Social Services Department confirming that they had no immediate placement available for the triplets. Mrs. Ademi and Mrs. Okonkwo have both agreed to speak on your behalf, which is huge because they carry significant influence with the board." "What about the other side?" Elizabeth asked, because she knew that someone must be arguing against her or there wouldn't be a hearing at all. Jennifer's expression darkened slightly. "There's a board member named Mr. Coker who's apparently been vocal about setting an example with your case. He believes teachers who break protocol, even with good intentions, need to face consequences, or it sets a dangerous precedent. He's been pushing hard for your termination." Elizabeth felt her stomach drop even further if that was possible. "Have you met him?" "Not yet," Jennifer said. "But I've heard he's rigid and traditional, the kind of person who believes rules exist for a reason and shouldn't be bent for anyone. He's going to be our biggest obstacle." At 2:45, Elizabeth walked across the school compound toward the administrative building, where the board meeting would be held, and she felt like she was walking toward her own execution. Jennifer walked beside her with confident strides, But Elizabeth noticed that even her young lawyer's hands were gripping her briefcase tighter than necessary. The administrative building was newer than the rest of the school, with air conditioning that actually worked and floors that didn't creak. And the conference room where they'd hold the hearing was on the second floor with windows that overlooked the playground, where children were running and laughing without any idea that their teacher's life was being decided just above their heads. The conference room was already full when they arrived, with 7 board members seated along one side of a long table and chairs arranged on the other side for Elizabeth and her witnesses. Principal Adebio sat at the head of the table looking uncomfortable, and Mrs. Okonkwo and Mrs. Ademi were seated in the row of chairs behind where Elizabeth would sit, their presence a silent show of support that made her feel less alone. But at the far end of the board member table sat a man who could only be Mr. Coker, tall and severe-looking with grey hair cut military short and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The chairman of the board, a woman named Mrs. Bacchia who looked tired enough to have been doing this job for far too long, called the meeting to order and read the charges against Elizabeth in a voice that was professionally neutral but not unkind. Unauthorized guardianship of students, violation of school protocol, potential liability risk to the institution, and conduct unbecoming of an educator. Each word felt like a hammer blow, and Elizabeth had to remind herself to breathe because her lungs seemed to have forgotten how. Miss Ray, you'll have an opportunity to respond to these charges and present your defense, Mrs. Bacchia said. But first, we'll hear from Mr. Coker, who has requested permission to address the board regarding this matter. Mr. Coker stood up with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was used to commanding attention. And when he spoke, his voice filled the room with an authority that made Elizabeth's spine straighten instinctively. Madam Chairman, fellow board members, I want to be clear that I have no personal animosity toward Miss Ray, he began, and Elizabeth noticed that he didn't look at her once while he spoke. By all accounts, she's a dedicated teacher who cares deeply about her students. However, caring about students and maintaining professional boundaries are not mutually exclusive concepts, and in this case, Miss Ray has crossed a line that we cannot ignore. He paused, letting his words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. If we allow teachers to take students into their homes without proper authorization, without background checks, without oversight from Child Protective Services, we open ourselves to enormous liability. What happens when the next teacher claims they were just trying to help, but they're actually putting children at risk? What happens when a student gets hurt in a teacher's care, and the parents sue the school because we established a precedent that this behavior is acceptable? Elizabeth felt her cheeks burning because she knew where this was going, knew that he was going to paint her as a liability regardless of her intentions. I understand that Miss Ray believed she was acting in the children's best interest, Mr. Coker continued, and now he did glance at her, his expression not cruel but immovable. But the road to problematic situations is often paved with good intentions. We have systems and protocols in place for a reason, and those systems must be respected even when they seem slow or inadequate. Miss Ray should have contacted social services and let them handle the situation through proper channels. By taking matters into her own hands, she not only violated school policy, but also potentially compromised these children's safety by acting without legal authority or proper resources. He sat down, and the silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back because she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Mrs. Bacchia looked at Jennifer and nodded. Would the defense like to respond? Jennifer stood up with a composure that Elizabeth envied, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. Thank you, Madam Chairman. With all due respect to Mr. Coker's concerns, I'd like to present a different perspective on this situation. Miss Ray didn't act impulsively or recklessly. She spent 3 days observing these children, checking with the school administration about their enrollment status, and watching them wait on the curb for guardians who never came. Only after exhausting her immediate options did she make the decision to provide temporary shelter. Jennifer pulled out a document from her briefcase and held it up. This is a statement from the Lagos State Department of Social Services confirming that on the date in question, they had no available emergency placements for the triplets. If Miss Ray had called them as Mr. Coker suggests, these children would have spent at least another week on the streets while paperwork was processed. Is that the outcome we want to encourage? Should teachers turn away from children in crisis because helping them might create liability concerns? Hey fam, I need to stop right here because what happens next in that conference room is going to determine everything. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, show me some love with a like, and drop a comment telling me whether you think the board is going to side with Elizabeth or Mr. Coker. What would you do if you were on that board? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this story, because I promise you, it's going somewhere powerful. Now let's get back to that conference room, because the testimony is about to get real. Jennifer continued, packing slightly as she spoke, her lawyer instincts taking over. Miss Ray has been teaching in this district for 24 years with an exemplary record. In that time, she has changed countless lives through dedication that goes far beyond what her salary compensates or what her job description requires. I know this personally because I was one of those students. Jennifer's voice softened slightly, and Elizabeth saw several board members lean forward with interest. 15 years ago, I was failing every class and had given up on myself completely. Miss Ray stayed after school every single day for 6 months to tutor me without asking for anything in return. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and because of her I went to university and law school, and now I'm here advocating for others who need someone to fight for them. That's what Miss Ray does. She fights for children who have no one else. Mrs. Adami stood up then, asking permission to speak, and Mrs. Bakya nodded. I'm not here as a character witness in the traditional sense, Mrs. Adami said, her expensive jewelry catching the light as she moved. I'm here to tell you that the Parent-Teacher Association has reviewed this case thoroughly, and we believe Miss Ray's actions, while unconventional, were both necessary and appropriate given the circumstances. We've approved emergency family assistance funding to help support her guardianship of these children, and we're prepared to provide ongoing resources to ensure their welfare. Mr. Coker's expression didn't change, but Elizabeth saw his jaw tighten slightly. With respect, Mrs. Adami, the PTA's approval doesn't change the fact that protocols were violated. We can't set a precedent that allows teachers to bypass established systems simply because they disagree with how slowly those systems move. Then perhaps we need to examine why our systems are so slow that children end up sleeping on the streets while we process paperwork, Mrs. Okonkwo said, standing up without asking for permission, her voice sharp with an edge that made several board members shift uncomfortably. I was the one who filed the original complaint against Miss Ray because I believed she was being irresponsible. But after investigating this situation, I've realized that the real irresponsibility belongs to a system that makes it easier to punish compassion than to protect children. Mrs. Bakya held up her hand for silence. I think we've heard enough arguments from both sides. Miss Ray, would you like to say anything in your own defense? Elizabeth stood up on shaking legs, her mouth dry and her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked at the 7 board members staring at her, waiting for her to justify a choice she'd made with her heart instead of her head, and she realized that no words she could say would change minds that were already made up. Mr. Coker had decided she was a liability before he'd ever met her, and the others would follow their own consciences regardless of what she said. But the triplets were probably sitting in her classroom right now, waiting to find out if the woman who'd promised them safety was going to be forced to break that promise, and they deserved to know that she'd fought for them with everything she had. I know I broke protocol, Elizabeth said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. I know I should have followed proper channels and filled out the right paperwork and waited for the system to do what it's supposed to do. But I also know that 3 children were sleeping on the streets, cold and hungry and scared, and I couldn't walk past them one more time and pretend I didn't see their suffering. If caring about that makes me a liability, then I'll accept whatever consequences you decide. But I won't apologize for choosing compassion over protocol, and I won't regret giving those children a chance at something better. She sat down, and the room was silent except for the muffled sounds of children playing outside. Mrs. Bakya looked at her fellow board members, and Elizabeth saw a range of expressions from sympathy to approval to Mr. Coker's unmoved severity. The board will need to deliberate, Mrs. Bakya said. We'll take a 30-minute recess and return with our decision. The board members filed out of the room, and Elizabeth sat frozen in her chair while Jennifer squeezed her shoulder and Mrs. Okonkwo whispered encouraging words that Elizabeth barely heard. 30 minutes to decide if 24 years of dedication mattered more than one broken rule. 30 minutes to determine if love counted for anything in a world that valued procedure over people. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, and Elizabeth found herself praying for the first time in months, not for herself but for the triplets who'd already lost so much and deserved to finally have something stable in their lives. She thought about Maya's confident declaration that morning, "You're going to win," and she hoped desperately that a child's faith would somehow prove stronger than an adult's fear of liability. When the board members returned, their faces were unreadable, and Elizabeth felt her stomach clench so tightly she thought she might be sick. Mrs. Bakya sat down and shuffled papers for what felt like an eternity before finally looking up and meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "The board has reached a decision," she said, and Elizabeth noticed that Mr. Coker was staring straight ahead with an expression that might have been anger or might have been resignation. "After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimony presented, we have voted 4-3 to take the following action." Elizabeth held her breath, her fingernails digging into her palms so hard she'd probably leave marks. "Miss Elizabeth Ray, you are hereby placed on probationary status for a period of 6 months," Mrs. Bacchia continued, and Elizabeth felt the world tilt beneath her because probation meant she still had her job. "During this time, you will be required to complete training on proper protocol for reporting child welfare concerns. You will work with legal counsel to finalize guardianship arrangements for the 3 minors currently in your care, and you will submit monthly reports to this board documenting the children's well-being and educational progress. Any further violations of school policy during this probationary period will result in immediate termination. Do you understand these conditions?" "Yes," Elizabeth managed to say through the tears that were now streaming freely down her face. "Yes, I understand." "Then this hearing is adjourned," Mrs. Bacchia said, and she allowed herself a small smile. "And Miss Ray, for what it's worth, I believe you did the right thing, even if you did it the wrong way." The room erupted in a chaos of voices as Jennifer pulled Elizabeth into a hug, and Mrs. Adami and Mrs. Okonkwo both started talking at once about next steps and resources. Elizabeth was vaguely aware of Mr. Coker leaving the room without speaking to anyone, his back rigid with disapproval, but she didn't care because she'd won. Against all odds and despite all the obstacles, she'd actually won. She rushed out of the administrative building and across the compound to her classroom, where the triplets were sitting with one of the other teachers who'd been watching them. The moment they saw her face, they knew, and all 3 of them ran toward her with the kind of joy that can't be contained or controlled. Elizabeth caught them in her arms and held on tight while they all cried together, relief and happiness, and the overwhelming knowledge that they were going to be okay. That evening, after they'd celebrated with pizza that Elizabeth couldn't really afford but bought anyway, because some moments deserved to be marked, after the children had finally fallen asleep exhausted from excitement, Elizabeth sat on her front steps and looked up at the Lagos sky, where stars were barely visible through the city lights. Jennifer had left an hour ago with promises to file all the necessary guardianship paperwork first thing Monday morning, and Mrs. Adami had stopped by to drop off a care package full of school supplies and groceries that would last them at least 2 weeks. Elizabeth thought about how close she'd come to losing everything, about the 4 board members who'd believed in her and the 3 who hadn't, about Mr. Coker's rigid principles and Mrs. Bacchia's small smile. She thought about Jennifer's testimony and Mrs. Okonkwo's transformation from adversary to advocate, and she realized that she'd never be able to thank them enough for standing beside her when it mattered most. But mostly, she thought about the 3 children sleeping inside her house, who now had legal protection and a future that extended beyond just survival. 6 months of probation seemed like nothing compared to what they'd gained, and if she had to fill out 1,000 reports and complete a dozen training courses, she'd do it gladly, because they were worth every single bureaucratic hoop she'd have to jump through. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and when she looked at the screen, she saw it was from a number she didn't recognize. The message was short and unsigned, but somehow she knew it was from Mr. Coker even before she read it. "I voted against you because I believe rules matter, but I hope you prove me wrong about what's possible when someone cares enough to break them. Those children are lucky to have you." Elizabeth stared at the message for a long time, then saved it in her phone because even critics deserve grace when they offer it, and because maybe, just maybe, this was proof that hearts could change even when minds stayed stubborn. She looked up at the stars again and whispered a thank you to whatever forces in the universe had conspired to bring her to this moment. And then she went inside to sleep in her too small house that was somehow big enough to hold 4 people and all the love they needed. What Elizabeth didn't know was that this was just the beginning of their journey together, and that the years ahead would bring challenges she couldn't imagine and triumphs she didn't dare hope for. But that night, she didn't need to know what was coming. That night, all she needed to know was that they'd survived the storm, and tomorrow the real work of building a family would begin. And somewhere in the city, 3 other people who'd been changed by Elizabeth's story were having conversations that would ripple out in ways nobody could predict, setting in motion events that wouldn't become clear for many years to come. 10 years passed in what felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat, and Elizabeth Ray watched 3 frightened children transform into confident teenagers who stood taller than she did and called her Mama without hesitation. The guardianship had been finalized after months of court hearings and paperwork that seemed designed to test her patience. But Jennifer had fought beside her every step of the way until the judge finally signed the papers that made it official. Michael, Marcus, and Maya Ray became their legal names, and Elizabeth's tiny house that barely fit one person somehow expanded to hold 4 lives intertwined so completely that nobody could remember a time when they'd been separate. The years hadn't been easy, though nobody ever said they would be. Elizabeth worked 2 tutoring jobs on top of her teaching salary, staying up until midnight gradding papers and helping with homework, and somehow finding energy she didn't know she possessed. The triplets thrived despite the financial struggles, or maybe because of them, learning early that love mattered more than money and that family wasn't defined by blood, but by the people who showed up day after day even when it was hard. They excelled in school, made friends, played football and joined the debate team and became the kind of teenagers who made their mother proud more often than they made her worried. But something shifted when they turned 16, a restlessness that Elizabeth recognized from her years of teaching, but hadn't expected to hurt this much when it was directed at her. They started spending more time in their rooms, more time with friends, more time anywhere that wasn't sitting at the dinner table talking about their days. When Elizabeth asked questions, she got one-word answers, and when she tried to enforce rules about curfews and homework, she got arguments that felt like walls being built between them. "They're just being teenagers," Jennifer said one evening when Elizabeth called her in tears after a particularly difficult fight with Marcus about his grades. "This is what teenagers do. They pull away so they can figure out who they are separate from their parents. It doesn't mean they don't love you." "I know that," Elizabeth said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But knowing it and feeling it are 2 different things. I keep thinking about all the years I spent worrying that social services would take them away, and now they're choosing to leave on their own." "They're not leaving," Jennifer reassured her. "They're just growing up." But Jennifer was wrong, because 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in March, Elizabeth woke up to find the triplets' beds empty, and a note on the kitchen table that shattered her world into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. The note was written in Maya's careful handwriting, and Elizabeth's hands shook so badly she could barely read the words. "Mama, please don't be angry and please don't worry. We love you more than anything in the world, but we need to do something important and we can't explain it right now. We promise we're safe and we promise we'll come back when the time is right. Trust us the way you taught us to trust you. Love always, Michael, Marcus and Maya." Elizabeth read the note 10 times, then 20, then lost count because the words kept blurring through her tears and none of it made any sense. She called their phones, but they went straight to voicemail. She called their friends, but nobody knew anything, or if they did, they weren't telling. She went to the police station and filed a missing persons report. But the officer looked at the note and said that technically they weren't missing if they'd left voluntarily. And at 16, they were old enough to make certain choices, even if those choices broke their mother's heart. "Give them a few days," the officer said with the tone of someone who'd seen this story before. Teenagers run off all the time and come back when they get hungry or scared or realize that the real world isn't as exciting as they thought it would be. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the triplets didn't come back. Elizabeth searched everywhere she could think of, called every contact she had, spent money she didn't have on a private investigator who found nothing except dead ends and disconnected phone numbers. She put up flyers around Lagos and Abuja with their photos and her contact information, and she waited by the phone every single night like somehow her desperate hope would be enough to bring them home. The other teachers at school tried to be supportive, bringing her food she couldn't eat and offering platitudes that rang hollow. Mrs. Okonkwo and Mrs. Ademi visited regularly, sitting with her in silence because sometimes there are no words that make grief more bearable. Jennifer worked every angle she had, calling in favors and pushing police contacts and checking with hospitals and shelters, but there was no trace of them anywhere. Elizabeth kept teaching because it was the only thing she knew how to do, and because staying home in that empty house was worse than facing a classroom full of students who reminded her of the children she'd lost. She taught through tears she tried to hide, through exhaustion that settled into her bones, through a pain so deep it felt like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. Her students were gentler with her than usual, like they sensed that their teacher was holding on to control by the thinnest of threads. 6 months passed, then a year, then 2 years, and Elizabeth stopped expecting them to walk through the door. She kept their rooms exactly as they'd left them, their clothes still hanging in the closet and their books still stacked on the shelves, but she stopped believing that arrangement was temporary. On their birthday each year, she lit candles on a cake nobody would eat and sang happy birthday to an empty room, and she wondered where they were, and if they ever thought about the woman who'd given up everything to give them a chance. The guilt was the worst part, the constant questioning of whether she'd done something wrong, whether she'd been too strict or not strict enough, whether she'd loved them too much or not shown it enough. At night, she replayed conversations and arguments and ordinary moments, searching for the clue that would explain why they'd left and where they'd gone. Jennifer kept telling her it wasn't her fault, that whatever they were doing had nothing to do with anything Elizabeth had done or failed to do. But guilt doesn't respond to logic, and Elizabeth carried it anyway. Hey my people, I know this is heavy and your hearts are probably breaking right now along with mine, but stay with me because this story is about to take a turn that's going to change everything you thought you knew. If you're feeling this, drop a like and tell me in the comments how you'd handle this situation if you were Elizabeth. Would you keep hopping or would you eventually let go? Subscribe to this channel because you need to see where this is heading, and I promise you won't regret it. Now let's jump forward to the moment that changed everything, because Elizabeth was about to discover that sometimes the longest journeys are the ones that lead us back home. 8 years after the triplets disappeared, Elizabeth Ray retired from teaching at the age of 62. The school board offered her a retirement party, but she declined because the idea of celebrating felt wrong when her heart was still broken. She collected her modest pension and moved through her days like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really being alive. The house felt bigger and emptier than it had when she'd lived there alone before the triplets arrived, as if their absence had somehow expanded the space rather than filled it. She spent her days reading books she didn't remember and watching television shows that blurred together, and she tried not to think about 3 children who would be adults now, somewhere in the world living lives she knew nothing about. Sometimes she allowed herself to imagine them happy and successful, building careers and families and futures that justified their disappearance. Other times, in her darkest moments, she imagined them in trouble or danger or worse, and those thoughts were the ones that kept her awake at night staring at the ceiling. It was a Sunday afternoon in November when Elizabeth heard the sound of car engines outside her house, unusual in a neighborhood where most people took public transportation, and the streets were usually quiet on weekends. She looked out her window and froze, her heart stopping in her chest because there were 3 luxury cars parked in front of her house, gleaming black vehicles that looked like they'd driven straight out of a movie, and into her dusty street where nothing exciting ever happened. Elizabeth's first thought was that something was wrong, that the police had finally found information about the triplets and had come to deliver news she didn't want to hear. She opened her door with trembling hands and a prayer on her lips, and then the world tilted on its axis because the people stepping out of those cars were faces she'd memorized and mourned for 8 years. Michael stood by the first car in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Elizabeth's monthly pension. His shoulders broader and his face more mature, but his eyes still the same warm brown that had looked up at her with trust all those years ago. Marcus emerged from the second car wearing casual but expensive clothes, and carrying himself with a confidence that came from success and achievement. And Maya stepped out of the third vehicle in professional attire with her hair styled elegantly and a leather briefcase in her hand. They were adults now in their mid-20s, and they looked like they belonged in a world Elizabeth had never been part of and couldn't imagine entering. For a moment, she thought she might be hallucinating, that grief had finally broken her mind and was showing her visions of what she wanted so desperately to see. But then Maya called out "Mama" in a voice that cracked with emotion, and Elizabeth knew this was real. She wanted to run to them, to throw her arms around them and never let go. But her legs wouldn't move and her voice wouldn't work because 8 years of pain and anger and desperate hope were all colliding in her chest at once. The triplets walked toward her slowly, like they were approaching something fragile that might shatter if they moved too fast. And when they reached her doorstep, all 3 of them had tears streaming down their faces. "Mama," Michael said, and his voice was deeper than she remembered but still achingly familiar. "We're so sorry. We're so incredibly sorry for leaving, for staying away, for every moment of pain we caused you. But we had to. We had to do this." "Do what?" Elizabeth finally managed to ask, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. What could possibly justify 8 years of silence? 8 years of wondering if you were alive or in trouble, or if you'd forgotten about me completely. "We could never forget you," Maya said, reaching out to take Elizabeth's hand, and Elizabeth let her even though part of her wanted to pull away and protect herself from being hurt again. "You were with us every single day, in every decision we made, in every goal we set. Everything we did was because of what you taught us and the life you gave us when we had nothing. Then why did you leave?" Elizabeth asked, and now the tears were falling freely down her cheeks. "Why did you disappear without explaining, without calling, without giving me any way to know you were okay?" Marcus stepped forward and pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper that looked worn from being carried for years. He handed it to Elizabeth, and when she unfolded it, she recognized her own handwriting from a school assignment she'd given years ago when the triplets were still in elementary school. The prompt had been, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And Elizabeth had saved their responses in a folder she'd kept all through their childhood. Michael's paper said he wanted to build schools for children like him who had nowhere else to go. Marcus had written that he wanted to design houses where homeless families could live. Maya's response said she wanted to become a doctor and help people who couldn't afford medical care. "We read these again the night before we left," Michael explained. "We realized that we'd been given a chance that most kids in our situation never get, and we felt like we had a responsibility to do something with that chance. Something bigger than just living comfortable lives and forgetting where we came from. But we also knew we couldn't do it while we were still here," Maya continued. "We needed to go somewhere else, to study and work and build ourselves into the kind of people who could actually make those dreams happen. And we knew that if we told you our plan, you'd try to talk us out of it, or you'd worry yourself sick, or you'd sacrifice even more than you already had to try to help us. So we left without saying goodbye because we were cowards," Marcus said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "We convinced ourselves we were protecting you, but really we were just too scared to face the conversation we should have had. And then time passed and we kept thinking we'd come back when we'd accomplished something worth showing you, something that would justify the pain we'd caused." Elizabeth looked at the three adults standing before her, and slowly the pieces started coming together in a picture she hadn't expected. "What did you accomplish?" Michael smiled through his tears. "I started a technology company that builds educational software and hardware for underprivileged schools. We've provided free tablets and internet access to over 300 schools across Nigeria, including the one where you used to teach. The program is called Ray Learning Initiative. I became an architect," Marcus said. "I specialize in affordable housing design for homeless youth and families in crisis. I've worked on projects in Lagos, Abuja and Port Harcourt that have provided stable homes for over 5,000 people. And every building has a plaque that says, in honor of Elizabeth Ray, who taught us that home is built with love, not just walls." Maya pulled out her phone and showed Elizabeth a website. "I'm a doctor now, and I've opened a network of free clinics in underserved communities. We provide healthcare, nutrition programs, and scholarship funds for children who need support. The foundation is called the Ray Foundation for Children in Need, and last year alone, we helped over 10,000 kids get the medical care and educational opportunities they deserve." Elizabeth stared at them, her mind struggling to process what they were telling her, because it seemed impossible that 3 children who'd arrived at her classroom with nothing had become these accomplished adults who were describing achievements she couldn't even fully comprehend. "But why now?" she asked. "Why come back after 8 years?" "Because we're finally ready to show you what we built," Michael said, "and because we want to give you something you gave us when we needed it most." Marcus stepped aside and gestured toward the cars. "We bought you a house, Mama, not here in Serula, but in a beautiful quiet neighborhood near Lekki where you can rest and breathe and finally stop worrying about leaking roofs and broken plumbing. It has a garden where you can grow flowers, and a library where you can read in peace, and enough space for all of us to visit whenever you want. And we've established a school in your name," Maya added. "The Elizabeth Ray Academy for Children in Transition. It's fully funded, fully staffed, and it's designed specifically for kids who are experiencing homelessness or family crisis. The kids who fall through the cracks the way we did before you caught us." Elizabeth felt like she couldn't breathe, like the world was spinning too fast and she couldn't keep up with what was happening. "I don't understand. How did you do all of this? Where did you get the money?" "We worked," Michael said simply. "We studied on scholarships we earned. We took jobs in tech and medicine and architecture. We saved every naira we made, and we invested it back into the dreams you taught us to believe in. It took 8 years of 70-hour weeks and sleeping 4 hours a night and sacrificing everything else in our lives, but we did it because we knew that if we could succeed, we could help thousands of other kids the way you helped us. We're not asking you to forgive us for leaving," Marcus said quietly. "We know we hurt you in ways we can never fully repair, but we're hoping you can understand why we did it, and that maybe someday you can be proud of what we built with the foundation you gave us." Elizabeth looked at the 3 faces that had haunted her dreams for 8 years, and she realized that they weren't children anymore. They were adults who'd made difficult choices and carried them through to completion, who'd sacrificed their own comfort and their mother's peace of mind for a goal they believed was worth the cost. She didn't know if she could forgive them yet, didn't know if the hurt they'd caused would ever fully heal, but she knew with absolute certainty that she loved them beyond measure and always would. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been proud of you since the moment you walked into my classroom looking lost and scared. I'm proud of the children you were and the adults you've become, even if the journey between those 2 points broke my heart into pieces." Triplets closed the distance then, and pulled her into a hug that felt like coming home after being lost for years. And Elizabeth held onto them with everything she had, while they all cried together on her doorstep. Neighbors started coming out of their houses to see what was happening, drawn by the expensive cars and the emotional scene unfolding in the middle of their quiet street. And Elizabeth didn't care who saw her tears or her joy or her confusion, because nothing else mattered except this moment. "Come see the house," Maya said when they finally pulled apart. "Come see everything we've built and tell us if we did it right. Tell us if we made you proud." Elizabeth nodded because she didn't trust her voice yet, and she let them guide her toward one of the cars that was probably worth more than everything she'd ever owned combined. As they drove through Lagos toward Lekki, Michael in the driver's seat and Marcus and Maya flanking her in the back, they talked about the 8 years they'd spent apart. They told her about late nights in university libraries, about their first jobs and first failures, about the moments when they'd almost given up and called her but pushed through because they'd promised themselves they wouldn't come back until they had something to show for the sacrifice she'd made. They told her about carrying her photo in their wallets, about the times they'd sat outside her house just to see her through the window and make sure she was okay, even though they couldn't bring themselves to knock on the door. They told her about the guilt that had eaten at them every single day, about the letters they'd written but never sent, about the 1,000 times they'd picked up the phone and then put it down because they didn't know what to say. Elizabeth listened and tried to understand, tried to reconcile the pain of their absence with the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. And she realized that this was what it meant to raise children who were bigger than you could imagine and braver than you knew how to be. She'd given them safety and love and a foundation to build on, and they'd taken that gift and multiplied it 1,000 times over in ways that would impact people she'd never meet and children she'd never teach. The house they'd bought her was more beautiful than anything she'd ever dreamed of, with wide windows that let in afternoon light, and a kitchen that actually had working appliances, and a bedroom that felt like a luxury hotel. But what made her cry all over again was the 4th bedroom they'd set up as a study, with her old teaching supplies arranged carefully on the shelves and photographs of her students covering the walls and a desk where she could write or read or just sit and remember. "We wanted you to have a space that honored everything you've done," Maya said softly. "Not just for us, but for all the students whose lives you've touched over the years. We tracked down as many of them as we could find, and they all sent photos and letters thanking you for believing in them." Elizabeth walked around the room touching the photographs with trembling fingers, seeing face after face of students she taught decades ago who were now doctors and teachers and engineers and parents themselves. Each photo had a note attached telling her what they were doing now and how she'd impacted their lives. And Elizabeth realized that her legacy was so much bigger than she'd ever understood. "The school opens next month," Michael said, pulling up photos on his tablet. "We have enrollment for 200 students in the first year, with plans to expand to 500 within 3 years. We've hired teachers who understand what these kids are going through, and we've partnered with social services to make sure every child has access to counseling, nutrition programs, and legal support if they need it. And we want you to be the honorary principal." "I'm retired," Elizabeth said automatically. "We know," Marcus replied. "We're not asking you to work 60-hour weeks or deal with bureaucracy. We're asking you to be there on the first day when the doors open, to welcome those kids the way you welcomed us, to show them that someone believes they matter and their lives have value. Just that one day, Mama, that's all we're asking." Elizabeth looked at the 3 adults who'd once been frightened children in her classroom, and she saw their hope and their nervousness and their desperate need for her approval of what they'd built. She thought about saying yes immediately, about jumping at this chance to be part of something that would help children the way she'd spent her whole life trying to help them. But there was something else that needed to be said first, something that had been building in her chest since the moment they'd appeared on her doorstep. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice steady now. "I need you to promise that whatever you do next, wherever your lives take you, you'll never disappear on me again. You can travel the world, you can build empires, you can change millions of lives, but you have to let me be part of it. You have to call me and visit me and include me in your journey, because I can't survive another 8 years of not knowing if you're okay." "We promise," all 3 of them said in unison, and Elizabeth saw the sincerity in their eyes and chose to believe it, because what else could she do except trust that they'd learned from their mistakes? "Then yes," she said, "I'll be there on opening day. I'll welcome those children and tell them that their lives matter and that someone believes in them. And maybe, if they're very lucky, they'll find someone who changes their world the way you 3 changed mine." The sun was setting over Lagos as they sat together in Elizabeth's new house, and for the first time in 8 years, she felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. There would be difficult conversations ahead about forgiveness and trust, and rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by time and distance. There would be moments when the hurt resurfaced and the anger returned, and she wondered if she'd ever fully heal from the wound their absence had created. But sitting there surrounded by the children she'd raised and the legacy they'd built together, Elizabeth realized that some stories don't have neat endings where everything is resolved and everyone lives happily ever after. Some stories are messy and complicated and painful, even when they're also beautiful and triumphant and full of love that refuses to give up. This was one of those stories, and it was still being written. Outside, a car pulled up that Elizabeth didn't recognize, and she watched through the window as a woman in her 40s stepped out carrying a folder. The woman looked around uncertainly, then checked an address on her phone before walking toward the house with determined steps. "Are you expecting someone?" Elizabeth asked, and the triplets exchanged glances that she couldn't quite read. "Not exactly," Michael said slowly. "But there's something else we need to tell you about. Something that happened 3 years ago that we've been trying to figure out how to explain." Maya stood up and went to answer the door, and Elizabeth felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, because she recognized that tone in Michael's voice. It was the same tone he'd used as a child when he'd broken something and was trying to find the courage to confess. The woman entered the living room with Maya, and she looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "Miss Elizabeth Ray?" she asked formally. "Yes," Elizabeth said, her heart starting to pound because she had no idea what was coming but knew instinctively that it was going to change everything again. "My name is Patricia Obi," the woman said. "I'm a social worker with the Lagos State Department of Child Welfare Services, and I've been asked by Michael, Marcus and Maya to deliver some information that I believe you'll want to hear." She opened her folder and pulled out paperwork that Elizabeth couldn't read from where she was sitting, and the woman's expression softened slightly. 3 years ago, Michael Ray contacted my department with information about a situation involving multiple children living in similar circumstances to what he and his siblings experienced. He provided funding for an investigation, and what we discovered was a network of over 50 children across Lagos who were essentially invisible to the system, attending schools sporadically, but with no permanent guardians or stable housing. Elizabeth's breath caught because she understood where this was going even before Patricia finished speaking. "Working with the Ray Foundation, we've placed 43 of those children in stable homes with guardians who have been vetted and supported through a program modeled after your own experience," Patricia continued. "But there are still 7 children who haven't found placements, and they're currently in temporary shelters waiting for families who want them." Patricia placed a photo on the coffee table, and Elizabeth found herself looking at 7 young faces ranging from about 5 to 12 years old, all staring at the camera with the same expression she'd seen on the triplets' faces 8 years ago. Lost, scared, hopping for something they didn't quite believe could happen. "We were wondering," Marcus said quietly, "if maybe you'd consider meeting them. Not to take them all in or to become their guardian, but just to meet them and see if any of them speak to your heart the way we did all those years ago. You always said you wished you could do more, could help more children, and now maybe you can." Elizabeth looked at the photo, then at her grown children who were asking her to consider opening her heart one more time to kids who needed exactly what she'd spent her life giving. She looked at the beautiful house they'd bought her with its extra bedrooms and spacious rooms, and she thought about retirement and rest, and the quiet, peaceful life she'd imagined having after all these years. And then she looked at those 7 faces again and saw herself reflected in their eyes. Saw the teacher who'd never been able to walk past suffering without stopping. Saw the woman who'd built a family out of nothing but love and stubbornness and faith that better things were possible. "When can I meet them?" Elizabeth asked, and the room erupted in smiles and tears and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be doing exactly what you were meant to do. But as Patricia started explaining the process, and the triplets started talking over each other with excitement about possibilities and plans, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She glanced at it absently, then froze as she read the words that would turn their celebration into something else entirely. "Miss Ray, this is Principal Thompson from Government Secondary School Eichja. One of your former students has been arrested for fraud and claims you can verify his alibi. He says you'll remember him as the boy you tutored every Thursday 15 years ago. His name is Daniel Adwale, and he needs your help immediately." Elizabeth stared at the message while chaos unfolded around her, and she realized with sudden crystalline clarity that her story wasn't just being written. It was accelerating in directions she couldn't control and couldn't predict. The past was reaching forward with demands she didn't expect. The present was offering opportunities that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, and the future was opening up with possibilities that seemed both impossible and inevitable. She looked up at the triplets who were watching her with concern now, having noticed her expression change, and she knew that whatever came next would test everything she thought she'd learned about sacrifice and love, and the complicated, messy, beautiful business of trying to make the world better one child at a time. "Mama," Maya asked, "what's wrong?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and handed Maya the phone so she could read the message. And as understanding dawned on Maya's face, Elizabeth felt the familiar weight settling back onto her shoulders. The weight of other people's problems, other people's pain, other people's desperate hope that someone would care enough to help. It was the weight she'd carried for 40 years of teaching, and apparently it wasn't done with her yet. "I think," Elizabeth said slowly, "we're going to need Jennifer's help again. And we're going to need to have a very long conversation about exactly what happened in all those years you were gone, because I'm starting to think there's a lot more to your story than what you've told me so far." Michael and Marcus exchanged another one of those unreadable glances, and Elizabeth saw something flicker across their faces that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. "There is more," Michael admitted. "There's a lot more, and some of it is going to be hard to hear." "Then we better start talking," Elizabeth said, and she settled back into her chair with the phone still buzzing with new messages, and the 7 children's photos still lying on the table, and the triplets looking at her with expressions that suggested the revelations about to come would shake the foundation of everything she thought she knew. Outside, the Lagos night pressed against the windows, full of secrets and stories and lives intersecting in ways that nobody could fully understand until they looked back and saw the pattern that had been there all along. And somewhere in that vast city, Daniel Adwale sat in a police cell waiting for a teacher who'd believed in him 15 years ago to remember his face and save him from accusations he swore weren't true. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to reveal how deep and complicated and impossibly tangled it had always been.